Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Amami Talks. I'm Amami. Today I want to watch together with you a video from the famous YouTuber Barrett. He is a pro-Chinese government YouTuber and he's actually quite famous on YouTube. And this video is named The Truth Behind China's Zero COVID Protests. I'm going to play the audio and I'm going to share you my opinion real time. So let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to another video. I want to talk about the protests and demonstrations that are currently occurring in China. And I'm going to give you my thoughts, opinions and what I've been seeing and reading over the last 48 hours, because I feel there is a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of conspiracy theory going around. So I'm going to try to stick as much as possible to the facts of the situation, and yeah, let's break it down in this video. So I think the catalyst for these demonstrations is what happened in Urumqi. Now, what happened in Urumqi, if you don't know, there was a fire in an apartment block and 10 people reportedly died in that fire. And this sparked a lot of outrage. Urumqi was a city that had been locked down for about 10 weeks, a long time. And from what I understand, one of the issues why this fire was as bad as it was, the emergency services were unable to get close enough to the building because there was many parked cars. And those parked cars were there because people were locked down, they couldn't come to the cars to move them. And also because some of those cars had been there for more than 2 months without being used, the batteries had gone flat. So this was the catalyst for these demonstrations. Now,
it is true that he said the cause of those protests were the Urumqi fire accident, but he intentionally or unintentionally missed a very important part. That is when those people in the Urumqi fire accident found the fire, they tried to leave the residential unit through emergency exit. What they found out, the emergency exit was closed, locked down by chains. Iron chains were there to stop them from running from the firing apartment. These citizens was asking for help to open the door in the WeChat group of their building, and their request has been ignored by the local Gestapo of Zero COVID policy. The neighbors and lower floors where the fire didn't spread to also were asking to help them, but at the end they couldn't, because they couldn't also get access to the emergency exit. These people could have run. There could have been no death at all, but they died eventually. They didn't only die from the accident, they also died from the lockdown due to zero COVID policy. Chinese government reported that there were 10 deaths, but it is not the first time that Chinese government lied about the death toll in any accident. Many local people said that there were 44 people dead that night in that building. I have no way to verify that, but I wouldn't be surprised to know in the future day that Chinese government is lying again.
the Western media have you believe that these demonstrations are, all over China with millions of people. Well, from what I understand, that is not the case. The main one that's being focused on is the one that took place in Shanghai. And from what I've read and what I understand, it started with a few hundred people, and in the end there was a few thousand people. Now you have to get that into context with the size of the city of Shanghai and also the amount of people in China. Actually, the people that are demonstrating and protesting are actually quite a small number if you compare them to the whole of the population of China.
Here he wants to convince you that the protest is just a minor issue. But let me tell you, up until the moment that his video was online, there are not only protests in Shanghai, but also in those cities: 北京、南京、杭州、郑州、广州、株洲、徐州、深圳、西安、乌鲁木齐、重庆、浙江、大理、厦门 even smaller cities like 乌镇 and 驻马店市. Students from more than 79 universities all over China have joined the protests.
Now, I think this incident in Urumqi, coupled with the fatigue of the Chinese COVID-0 policy, is what has kicked off these demonstrations. Now, I've been reading a lot on social media. Now, what you have to understand is most of the information about these protests is not available inside the Chinese mainland. It will be censored. But I'm seeing a lot of information on sources outside of Chinese social media, on places like Facebook and Twitter. And it seems to be pointing to foreign involvement in the protests in Shanghai. Now, I don't think there's any fast, hard evidence of foreign involvement. It does appear that there was a Telegram group that was sort of full of mainly Western journalists. And in fact, one Western journalist, Ed Lawrence from the BBC, was arrested yesterday. It said he was treated quite bad, he was beaten. I have no idea if that's the case or not. However, he was part of this Telegram group, and there was a number of people on Twitter suggesting that this Telegram group was to sort of stir up the protests in Shanghai. Now, at this point in time, I don't think there's enough evidence, hard evidence, to say that is the case.
Remember at the beginning of the video, he said that he's going to stick to the truth, stick to the facts. But the only two facts actually that I've heard from this whole section of his video is, first, there was a Telegram group of Western media journalists. Oh, surprise, surprise, they couldn't use WeChat because every information they send in the WeChat will be censored by the Chinese government and will be used against their informants. And also, why are you listing things, conspiracy theories from Twitter, Facebook, and giving everything all together to people? As if you are trying to stay objective, but you are giving them so much details for people to suspect that there are meddlings going around in those so-called Telegram groups of Western journalists, while you have no evidence. What are you trying to insinuating here is those Western medias are the reason of the protests. You have no proof, so you have to say it again and again.
I think it's very stupid for foreigners to get involved in demonstrations in China. They are in fact guests of that country.
Okay, now foreigners in China, if you want to get involved into the protests and you think you can protect yourself, you sympathize with people suffering from this government, do participate. Do not let him brainwash you about so-called theory of guest of the country. I don't even know what that means. You are your own independent human beings. You decide what you do. Don't let anyone trick you into thinking you are a so-called guest of the country just because the country has a very rigid visa application system. And also, your participation could really help the Chinese citizens to be protected from their own police. With only you standing there with a camera recording everything that's happening, it could reduce a lot of the police brutality, because the police will be more civil when there are foreigners around.
and they should stay out of any demonstrations. As far as media are concerned, then yes, media accredited press should be there, but they should report the facts. They shouldn't report in any biased sense. And as we all know, Western journalists tend to report on China in a very biased manner.
Okay, so Western media tend to report China on a very biased manner. How so? What's the bias in this incident?
Now, many Chinese I know and speak to are really, really fed up with the COVID-0 policies of China. And about 2 weeks ago, the central government drew up a 20-point plan to kind of ease the lockdowns. But I think the problem is a lot of local, provincial authorities have misinterpreted these directions from central government and still putting people into fairly stringent, severe lockdown. And I think this is causing a backlash from many people who are just absolutely fed up with it.
Now, did the Chinese central government draw up a 20-point plan to ease up the COVID restriction? Yes, but did they punish the local government that executed their 20-point plan? Yes. It's very common in Chinese political system that what you are going to execute as a local leader is not the law or the guideline from central government, but the thinking of the ruling class. And as we all know, there is only one person that can be recognized as ruling class in China.
I have been outside of China since June of this year. Pretty much every country I've travelled to, there are no restrictions. And that's not to say that the COVID-0 policy in China is wrong. China have a very difficult balancing act. If you take the USA, if you take the UK, we have seen many, many deaths in those countries, and we continue to see deaths. Now, whether and how many of those deaths in the West are still from COVID, it's very difficult to ascertain because the government are not really maintaining the data on the case numbers, the deaths, the hospitalizations, etc. So it's quite hard to find accurate data. However, modelling that's been done in China suggests if they just let COVID spread, that many people will become seriously ill and potentially die. And that's because I see that there's one big problem in China, is that a lot of the elderly have not had vaccinations. If we look at the cases currently in China today, the 28th of November, there were 40,000 new cases. Now, many of those are asymptomatic, but those people are tending to still be taken to central quarantine areas, and that's in my opinion really not ideal. It would be much better, in my opinion, if they could quarantine in their homes. But the big fear is that many elderly people get sick or ill or die, and that is really something that is not going to look good for the Chinese authorities, because they've spent the last 2 or 3 years showing how well they have controlled it, and really saying that how poor other countries have done. They've also instilled somewhat an element of fear into the population about the spread of COVID, that many people will die, X, Y, Z. So I think many of the people are very, very nervous.
Protecting the elderly is a speech that Chinese government used to convince people to follow the zero COVID policy. And I would say that Chinese citizens are more loving and caring towards their elderlies. But it's not like nowadays they suddenly change and they want all their parents and grandparents to die for the economic growth. People started to see that what the government has been touting about protecting the elderly it's actually not the objective of those strict policies. You see, they throw the elderly into so-called capital units hospital. For me, it's COVID concentration camp. COVID patients and people who had close contact with them were thrown into the concentration camp with no medical care. If you have a fever in the camp, don't expect to get medicine for the fever. And they even throw elderlies also into that concentration camp. Elderlies with more prominent health threat, like diabetes, like high blood sugar, high blood pressure, cancer, you name it. They throw lung cancer patients into COVID concentration camp. Lung cancer elderly. And they dare to claim that this is for the health of the elderly. They are literally killing the elderly in those camps.
Now, as far as these protests calling for the downfall of the CPC, that is something where I do think this is coming from foreign involvement. I really believe that there are still a lot of people in China who support COVID-0. And on top of that, the Chinese government generally has a lot of support from its people. They've done miraculous things to the standard of living for people in China over the last 25 years. And I don't think this issue is really the Chinese people calling for the downfall of their government. I really don't think that at all. I may be wrong, but I really don't think that at all.
At this point, I quite agree with him, because right now people are asking for their normal life to be back, not overthrowing the government.
I've also read a number of articles that suggest that the Chinese authorities and the Chinese government may be keeping this COVID-0 to control the people. And again, I really don't think that is the case. The Chinese economy is really hurting at the moment, and I think as soon as the Chinese government feel they can open up, then I think they will, because they know it's hurting their economy. They want to get the economy rocking and rolling again. So I think this speak about them wanting to control the people through COVID-0 is just nonsense. And you can see, the reports already in the Western media that it's almost they're rubbing their hands together with glee, thinking that there's protests to bring down the government, because that's what they want. I'm sure that from what I've seen of this Telegram channel, it does seem that the Western press are very happy to see this kind of thing. It would please the West nothing more than if they thought there was going to be a downfall of the Chinese government. But as I say, the people of China really support their government. Of course, not all, but a vast majority of them do.
The vast majority of the Chinese people support the Chinese government, yet the government wouldn't dare to have people voting for them to really physicalize the support. Is that support real, or the support reinforced by the lack of selection and the lack of information?
And I really, really don't think the Chinese people are calling for a downfall of the government. I just want to touch on one other thing. There are news sort of circulating in China that, and again, this is sort of bordering on conspiracy, that a number of private labs have got contracts in areas to do the COVID testing. Now that's obviously very, very lucrative for those companies involved. You take a city like Shenzhen where there's 20 million people, and even if that company is making 1 yuan off each of those people for COVID testing, and that is a lot of money. And it just seems that that there are reports that are saying that when these private companies get a contract for a certain area or district or city, then COVID seems to take off in those cities, and all of a sudden we need to do mass testing. Now, whether that is the case or not, I really don't know for definite, but that's what I'm hearing from China. I'd also like to say that not all areas are as strict with the lockdowns as others. So my wife, she lives in Shenzhen, and they've had cases there, and the lockdowns have been very, very selective on buildings and not for a long time. Now, they've managed to control COVID in Shenzhen very, very well. I think at the moment, I think it was yesterday, they had 80 new cases. They have cancelled a lot of social things, but the lockdowns are very, very sort of isolated and selective. However, they do have to have mass testing very, very regularly. Okay, so let me give you my thoughts on this. I think the authorities and I think China have a big dilemma. If they open up too quickly and it spreads too quickly, they may have a lot of deaths on their hands. They may also have an overwhelmed healthcare system. And that's not something that people want to see in China. I don't think anybody wants to see that. However, I also believe that with the variants that are now circulating, I think it's going to be almost impossible to maintain a COVID-0 approach. You know, what happens is they if you have a severe lockdown, they snub it out. But as soon as they start to relax things, it takes off again. And I think in Beijing, today there's over 300 cases which they cannot trace in the community. So where these have come from, we don't know. I suspect that in many areas in China, they will actually lose control. I mean, the kind of numbers that we're talking about seem to be growing. And I think unless they have very, very strict lockdowns, they will not be able to control it. And I think if they do have severe lockdowns, people will rebel. We've seen this in a number of places. People are just absolutely sick and tired of the restrictions. They want freedom of movement. They want freedom to be able to travel. This is a pretty controversial video. I'm not trying to take one side or the other. I'm just trying to give you the situation as I see it. I think there's too many conspiracy theories sort of flying around social media in the West at the moment. And I also feel it seems to be that, you know, whenever something negative happens in China, the Western media are rubbing their hands together with glee. I think that's very, very sad. Anyway, please let me know what you think down in the comments below. I think this could be a very, very lively comment section, so please let me know what you think.
I will cut up his outro part of the video and just talk about what he said about different conspiracy theories. Now, why Chinese citizens suspect that there are people making profit from faking positive COVID results? Everything started with people getting the Omicron variant. They haven't suffered from the so-called severe syndrome of COVID, like losing the ability to breathe, heavy fever that lasts for days or even weeks, contraction of certain type of genital, etc., etc. They didn't even suffer from fever. They were not coughing, like they were basically normal, as many people with Omicron are. But holding the positive PCR result on hand, they assumed that the agency were faking the result to get profit from them being thrown into COVID concentration camp, or from lockdown of the city, so the PCR agency or PCR company can keep making more tests and make more money out of those tests. That's exactly a repercussion of the communication from Chinese government, the over-exaggeration about the COVID syndrome, the ignore of the slight side effect caused by the Omicron variants, just so people rigidly follow the zero COVID and the lockdown policy. People started to look for their own explanation. So what they feel and what they see fits into the official narrative of COVID is really severe and you should not feel like nothing when you are infected. Of course, I'm not saying that there is absolutely no company or agency or people getting lucrative gains by faking positive COVID result. I do think if any public holds any detail of their allegation, they should be able to pursue the case officially and transparently. Regarding the other conspiracy about government executing more control over the society, I have no proof because the only person that could testify to that or objectify to that is not going to answer my question. So that's something I couldn't prove or disprove. But yeah, that's a theory. At the end, I don't want to disqualify his whole video because I don't think he's giving you a full propaganda that Chinese government wants. But in some certain point relating to Western media, relating to foreign involvement, and relating to telling foreigners not to participate in Chinese political protests are in the wish list of Chinese government towards English-speaking YouTubers. I have no proof that such a wish list exists, but it will be there if it exists. I suspect it merely because these are the exact speaking point from the Chinese state media to Chinese people.
大家请看，这是3单元的严拿铁丝绑着呢。我从4单元把这个门开以后过来以后，我们逃生逃到3单元，它就锁上，我们都过不去。看清楚。
Üstüge tutuşup ketdi, 3 qavat mağanımızga hazır. Otucurasının turda mana yok. O şaylı geç. Aslı Anisan'ın yanında bir yolu vardı, bularının unum takıldı, nekçiler.
Qabat öket bağlı. Maşın tatlısı olup ki ayadın. Aslında mı sizin ailem? Sizden mayak öldüğünü yapacak olur. Öldüğünü ve mayak öldüğünü. 这么安静了？打咱！我们纪律层层不讲了，安静了，保持安静。把路都封到起嘛，他出不去，就他。
要是不然继续好不好？我不然继续好不好？
我们继续吧。